All right, hello, let's get started here. So I saw while I was cruising around on the old internet, I saw this video says why this famous atheist became a progressive Christian, and it's Dr. Philip Goff. So as some of you may know from watching this channel, I know Philip. He's been on Consciousness Live several times. I've interviewed him extensively about panpsychism and his views related to consciousness and mind. He's a nice guy. I find his arguments unconvincing and his views sort of facile, but that's a neither here nor there. Now, I also know that he, has this book that has came out called "Why the Purpose of the Universe," where he's argued for what seems like a middle ground between atheism and theism. So this says he's changed his mind and became a Christian of some sort. So I read something about this. He has an Eon piece that I saw this. So I figured maybe it'd be fun to go ahead and watch this video and give my 2 cents on it. Now, for those of you who know me, and if you've paid attention to things that I've said over the years on this channel, then you may know that my views about philosophy of religion are somewhat complex. So when it comes to when it comes to all the known religions of the world, I'm just a straight up atheist. I'm pretty sure that I know that Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, etc., are false. I know there is no such thing as Allah, Jehovah, Zeus, Poseidon, Zoroaster, or Mazda, any of these guys. So when it comes to that kind of supernatural stuff, I'm just pretty much convinced that there's no evidence for it. When it comes to the question, the more abstract question of does reality have some sort of creator, or is there a purpose or something like that, and something that set the system that we live up in, my views have generally tended towards agnosticism, that thinking there's some reason to think that yes, and there's some reason to think that no. Since I've been thinking about the simulation hypothesis a lot over the last few years, I've sort of come to think that all of the arguments for the existence of God really are better construed as arguments that we're in a simulation. So my official position now is there's more reason to believe that we live in a simulation than there is to believe in any kind of supernatural God. So that's makes me, I guess, a slightly, well, it depends on how you think of things. So I'm still agnostic about, is there a creator? Is this world one that has a creator? Not agnostic about the existence of the gods of any of the known religions of humankind. But I sort of think that thinking about the simulation has taken away some of my belief that the creator is a supernatural thing, and allowed me to see a way in which it could just be a natural thing. So that's sort of where I stand here. Just at going into this, like I said, I know a little bit about what's going to be said here, but I don't know exactly how this interview is going to go. I don't really know this channel, Capturing Christianity. I don't know. Maybe I've seen or heard of this guy. What's his name? I don't know. I might have seen or heard of this guy around the various I think this is him right here, actually. 3 more questions for atheists. Yo, okay. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into this and see what they say.
Well, Philip, it's great to be here with you in person. You've got a big announcement for us today, don't you?
Oh, yeah. See,
Thanks.
See, that was him. Good. I'm good. Okay, good.
Philip, it's great to be here with you in person. You've got a big announcement
Yeah, see, same guy. Okay, good.
for us today, don't you?
Thanks, Cameron. It's good to be here. Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. So this is a long time coming, though, and let's just get right to it. You've converted to Christianity, but it may not be the Christianity that people are necessarily expecting. It's a very unique version, and it's a version that you've come to after a long journey and philosophical process. So tell us, like, what version of Christianity that you have now say converted to, and then help set us up for what people can expect if they watch this entire video. Like what sort of topics are we going to get into today?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. It has indeed been quite a journey and something I've been thinking about for a long time. I never thought a few years ago I'd end up a Christian. But as you say, what I've ended up with is maybe quite an unusual form of Christianity. I don't believe in the virgin birth. I don't believe in an all-powerful God. I think the Bible is wrong about a lot of stuff. And I'm very uncertain whether it's all true. So, in a way,
Thursday Boots makes the highest quality boot and sells them at the lowest sustainable markup possible. This is their...
make those monies.
In one sense, at least, it hasn't been that radical a shift. You know, what's basically happened is after a long time of very wide reading and many, many conversations with lots of different kinds of Christian thinkers, I've discovered a form of Christianity that makes intellectual sense to me, and also that really deeply resonates. So that might sound a bit weird. How can that be Christianity? But maybe if we dig deep, we can start to make a bit more sense of this.
Yeah, so most people will actually be more familiar with you with your work on consciousness and how it relates to reality. We don't have to get into too many details, but just maybe give us a sense of the journey that led you here. Where did it sort of begin for you?
I think this started 6 years ago, actually, when I was asked to teach philosophy of religion. As you said, I've normally done philosophy of mind before. So this is when I first came to Durham University in the UK, which is my current university. And so they asked me to teach a fairly standard philosophy of religion course. You teach the arguments against God, you teach the arguments for God, then the students make up their mind which they find more compelling and write their essay. Right, so I started with the classic argument against the existence of God, the challenge of reconciling a loving, all-powerful God with the terrible suffering we find in the world. And I thought to myself, yeah, very convincing, definitely no God, job done. But then it came to the arguments for the existence of God, and I found myself thinking, actually, these are quite compelling as well. Particularly the argument from the fine-tuning of physics for life, this discovery of recent decades that many of the numbers in physics are against incredible odds just right for the possibility of life. So I was finding both sides compelling.
So this is something that strikes a chord with me as well, because I similarly taught philosophy of religion and find both of those arguments compelling. I like the fine-tuning argument. I think it's the most compelling argument for some kind of designer. That's for sure. It's not knocked down, though. I like the argument from evil. I think it is pretty knocked down, at least against a God of a certain kind. So I guess that's where this is going to go, is that he's going to deny that kind of God. But well, let's wait and hear what he's going to say before I start flapping off at the.
And this left me with quite some difficulty, right? Because I kind of live out my philosophy. These aren't abstract intellectual puzzles for me. If I don't know what I think on some philosophical matter, I literally can't sleep, you know? Yeah. So I was really wrestling with this for quite some time. And at some point, I just had a real eureka moment. I'd been assuming these arguments pushed in opposite directions, so you had to work out which you agreed with.
Or you suspend judgment and go for agnosticism, which is what I recommend.
But actually, I don't think they do. You know, the classic argument against God is arguing against a very particular form of God, what we call the omni-God, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good. But the arguments for God, or at least the fine-tuning argument for God, is arguing for something much more generic, something God-ish, just some kind of purpose or goal-directedness in the early universe. So I realized if you go for something God-ish, but you don't go for the omni-God, then you can sort of have your cake and eat it. And then this eventually turned into the book I published last year, modestly titled Why? The Purpose of the Universe. And that was essentially saying, look, we've had this never-ending debate between traditional atheists and traditional theists, but...
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here. Big Wireless has once again raised their prices. In response...
But they both have something right, they both have something wrong, and there's a middle ground option we can explore here. So that was the kind of gateway drug. And a year later, I've ended up in this weird position of being a kind of mildly heretical Christian, as we'll.
So I find this to be a little bit puzzling. So first of all, I share similar sentiments that these are the two arguments that push you and pull you. So it seems like agnosticism is where you ought to end up, especially because of all the flaws in the fine-tuning argument. It's not 100% clear how it's supposed to work out. But even so, I think that all of these push towards the simulation hypothesis more than the existence of some kind of supernatural God. So there's evidence for a creator. There's evidence that that creator is less than perfect. If you take that seriously, those are compatible with the simulation hypothesis. So I wonder if they're going to get into that, because why jump immediately to the existence of some kind of supernatural thing? Now, I know it fits kind of in the background with Philip's own considered views about the cosmopsychism and the mind as a consciousness, and the universe itself sort of being a mind or something like that. So I wonder if that's going to play a role in here as well. Yeah, interesting.
Into.
Yeah, so you had two sides of the argument. You had atheism on the one hand, and then you had the sort of omni-God, the traditional concept of God as this perfect being, omnipotent, omniscient, and everything. And you thought that those were the only really two options on the table. And so a lot of people, I think, in your position, I know them personally, would conclude something like more along the lines of agnosticism. Like, let me just be, because there's arguments for both sides, let me just remain agnostic and just not really make a decision either way. But in your case, you've thought, well, actually, are those the only two options on the table? There's got to be some other third way. And so tell us more about this third way. How does this God that you've arrived at, if you even want to call it God, what do you think this being is like?
Yeah, it's good to ask about agnosticism. I have a lot of conversations with my friend and colleague Jack Symes, we have a very similar starting point, that there's something right about both sides of this debate that leads him to agnosticism. But I guess my position is there is a position, I think, a middle way position that accounts for all the data. And that is the hypothesis of a God of limited power.
Okay. So that's the only limitation that you would include. Is that, do I have that correct?
Yeah, a good God of limited power. Okay. I think is.
But
so the simulation hypothesis accounts for all the data. So why a good God? And by the way, why is the God in his scenario good as opposed to an evil God, which would also account for all the data? And why is it Christianity as opposed to a version of Islam or some other religion where there's a... so I'm not seeing how this is supposed to account for all the data, or how it's the only one that accounts for all the data. Okay, well,
limited in goodness, unlimited in knowledge as well.
Yeah. So some people say, well, why not an all-powerful bad God? Right. But I think that leads to the mirror image of the problem of evil, right? The problem of good, right? If our world has an evil creator, why all the good things, flowers and smile of a baby and love and so on. And Stephen Law has, explored this very well with the evil God challenge. The good God, all-knowing, but not all-powerful, can perhaps explain the data. So, I mean,
So, wait a minute. That's too quick, because if you're going to opt for a limited power God, then you could say the same thing about the evil God. So maybe it's a evil God of limited power, and that explains why there's good things, the baby smile and the love or whatever the case may be. So if you're going to say, I reject that God's all powerful, but I still want to say he's all knowing and good unlimitedly, then you need additional arguments for that. And so far, all I've seen is a stipulation that the God is good, but the evil God, who's got limited power, explains all the data just as well. So that's kind of not really on the point there, I guess I'd say. All right, well, let's see if they address this.
One way of putting the challenge of the problem of evil is, why would a good God who can do anything choose to create life through the gruesome, torturous process of evolution by natural selection, right?
Yeah.
But
Good news travels fast. Ookla ranked optimum fiber speeds the fastest and most reliable. And PC Magazine.
if God is not all-powerful, maybe God didn't have much choice, right? Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a world, a universe with the right physics that will eventually evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I know it's going to be messy. I'm sorry. I wish it could be another way, but it's that or nothing.
Yeah.
So I think this hypothesis.
So why isn't nothing better? That's something I guess I'd want to point out is, if you're really imagining a morally perfect being of limited power, then I don't really find it plausible that they would, knowing that it's going to be messy, bring it about. What reason is there to think the messiness outweighs the problems? So if your choice is to create something that's going to have some good in it, but also some tremendous evil in it, some tremendous good too, but tremendous evil, and you're morally perfect, I don't know what justifies you in making that decision. So it doesn't seem to add up to me. Now, I'm not morally perfect, so I have a lot of shortcomings, but I assume that if you're morally perfect and you're limited in power, you're not going to do anything which is going to cause so much suffering. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know, but that's my feeling, is that seems fishy.
This can explain the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes, but can also explain the suffering in terms of God's limitations. So both sides, traditional atheism, traditional theism, both have something they can't explain. I really think this hypothesis can explain all the data, so I really think it's where the evidence is pointing.
That's also explained by the simulation hypothesis, by the evil God hypothesis of limited power. So this is just one possible explanation that covers everything. But why opt for it out of the other three? So I find the simulation hypothesis is much more plausible than an morally perfect creator of limited power. I actually find more plausible a evil creator of limited power. So yeah, I don't know. It just seems like he's biased towards which conclusion he wants to support with this kind of evidence.
Well, here's one other consideration that I'm sure that some people watching this are going to have this concern as well. For some people, the only viable alternative, or the only viable concept of theism is going to be that perfect being theism, where he's got all the omnis and he's perfect and he's perfectly powerful or unlimited in power. And so how would you respond to someone that has that kind of worry? There's different ways to flesh out that worry. For example, Josh Rasmussen has this argument from limits. So he argues that any being or thing that has limits at the fundamental level seems to conflict with other things that we know about causation. So for example, anything that is limited needs some sort of cause. And so if we have a foundational item that explains everything else, that itself has limits, that seems to conflict with what we know about limits more generally, needing causes. And this thing is supposed to be uncaused, so then how do we reconcile that view? So that's one way to sort of flesh out this concern. But what are your thoughts on people that view the pool of options available to theists is very limited? It's limited to this perfect being, right? I know people that are going to have this concern. So how do you address that?
Yeah, and I've got a lot of respect for Josh's work, and I think him and also Richard Swinburne, I actually think they've made a good case that the omni-God is a very simple hypothesis, that it avoids it's a more complex hypothesis, slightly more complex hypothesis if God has certain limitations, because we then want to know, well, why limited there? I think though, we never entirely get rid of the explanatory demand why. Even when you've got the very simple omni-God, you've still got the question, why? Why is there a God rather than just a big bang or something? You've always got the why question. You can't entirely get rid of it. So we want to have the most simple hypothesis we can, right? But
Here's to delicious fall favorites. Made with love right at home.
But we also want the hypothesis to fit the data. And so I think, yes, the omni-God hypothesis is simpler than the limited God hypothesis. But the limited God hypothesis is not that complicated. It's still fairly simple. And I think it fits the data better. So ultimately, I think that's the one we should go for. Maybe I could give you an analogy that Richard...
Just before he does, this is a non-answer. So what is the cause or explanation of this proposed limit? Like he even said, why is it limited in this way? And this idea of fitting the data is total BS, because as we've already pointed out several times, there are other ways to fit this data, namely evidence for a kind of creator and evidence of suffering. So there's other ways. The simulation hypothesis is one, the evil God that's limited in power is another one. So we haven't yet really found a reason to prefer this version of it, and we haven't gotten an explanation why this particular postulate is the way that it is. So I really think he's not doing a great job here.
Swinburne himself comes up with. He says how before we had evidence to the contrary, we took the speed of light to be infinite, because infinity is a simpler value than some particular speed. But once we had evidence to the contrary, we accept that, right? We want to fit the data ultimately. We don't tie ourselves in knots to try and preserve the idea that the speed of light is infinite. So similarly, I think we do have evidence to the contrary of the omni-God, namely suffering. And so we shouldn't tie ourselves in knots trying to keep the omni-God when we can move to a slightly less simple hypothesis that God's limited in certain respects that I think fits the data better.
So, by the way, speaking of that, why limit the power? So an all-powerful God that's limited in knowledge would also fit the data. An all-powerful God, all-knowing God who's limited in morality would also fit the data. So why limit the power? So that's just another way of asking the same question that just occurred to me. But it's like, okay, so if this God's less than morally perfect, then he may know how to do it and have the power to do it, but not be more moved by his or their morality system to do it. On the other hand, if they don't know how to do it, even if they have all power, those two are often linked now that I'm thinking about it. So how could you know everything and not? So God knows how to get rid of evil, but just can't do it. I don't know. So I find this all very confusing and not very well motivated. I know this is just an interview, but I don't think in the Eon piece he addresses any of this stuff either.
Here's what I really, really like about your view, okay, is that, well, actually, just considering your view over the last couple of years has made me actually take atheism a lot less seriously. And I don't know that you'll like me saying this, but because, you know, atheism is a very well-respected option in academia, but because of your view, this new possibility that God, maybe he's just limited in power and everything else is unlimited, and that accounts for the data just as well. You know, all the data of evil and suffering and even divine hiddenness, it accounts for all of that data. And so why not opt for this option that explains, you know, everything that we see, from consciousness to the order in the universe to moral knowledge to all of the, you know, psychophysical harmony, all of these different things that we see in the world that we observe. It explains all of those. And so you don't have to resort to atheism or be an atheist. You can still have the explanatory resources and have a very robust ontology that can explain things. So it's led me, in short, it's led me to take atheism a little bit less seriously. I mean, I think that that's a good thing as a Christian.
Yeah, that's really nicely put.
So nicely put. Oh my God. Okay, so this is some grade A bullshit right here. So take atheism less seriously. First of all, you have to be moved by the fine-tuning argument, which not everybody is. So many people find the fine-tuning argument to be easily dismissed there for multiple reasons. One, it's not impossible that it's just chance. You may not like that, but it's certainly, you could use anthropic reasoning. Some people like that. On the other hand, that it's kind of, somewhat arbitrary to say that life is fine-tuned, or physics is fine-tuned for life, because what really seems to be the case is that physics is fine-tuned for the kind of life that we have. And a God of great power, not even all power, but great power, should know how to create life in many different physical configurations. So I know Philip has a lot to say about the multiverse and all that stuff. I think he's wrong about that, largely speaking. But some people might even say that this idea is kind of a consequence of modern physics, that there's going to be many different universes, and that that explains why the appearance of fine-tuning exists. So you may not agree with all that, but many people do. So just saying this makes you take atheism less seriously. Okay, so that's bias showing again there. But why doesn't the existence of the simulation hypothesis lead you to take theism less seriously? I'm not sure why it's not going the other way. Oh, you have a bias? Okay. Anyway, okay, so that I wasn't expecting that kind of ridiculousness. And Philip's agreeing with it? Oh, this is embarrassing. Okay.
Cameron, that's really... But I suppose I, as the middle way person, I'm always the middle way person, the middle way guy. I think it cuts both ways, right? It's like, I just sort of feel like atheists are tying themselves up in knots trying to deal with fine-tuning. Theists are trying to tie themselves up in knots.
We think some of the details that make Thursday Boots most special are the ones that you can't see. Hey everyone, I'm Connor.
I don't know how many of these ads I'm going to be able to take. This is a lot of ads. We're only 13 minutes in. There's been like 5 or 6 ads.
Look, there's a hypothesis on the table here that avoids all these difficulties. What's the problem?
Well, and it makes me think like everyone should at least be a theist. I mean, I look at your view almost as like a worst case scenario, and I don't want you to take that the wrong way. I'm not saying that it's like, the actual worst, but in worst case, everyone should still be a theist.
Well, yeah, actually, my friend Max Baker Heitch said that to me fairly recently, that he's a more traditional Christian.
Geez, Philip loved the name drop, man. Name drop. Okay, no, everyone should be a simulation hypothesis person. I don't know. That's much more plausible. Okay, I'll let it go.
Maybe more on my side with it being so uncertain, but he's a more traditional Christian, but he likes my view as a kind of backup. I guess ultimately he'd prefer to go for the omni-God, but these matters are very inherently uncertain, and it's nice to have that backup possibility, especially if it kind of fits with Christianity, which I'm increasingly thinking it does. So I'm very happy for traditional Christians to think of my view in that way. But look, I mean, I think we should all have, whether atheists, theists, have some humility here that these are very difficult questions, and we should all be a little bit open-minded.
Are there any other arguments for or against the existence of God that you think we should sort of note here before we move into the particulars of Christianity? Are there any other arguments that you considered and you were like, okay, this is another argument, a really strong argument for theism. Here's another good argument for atheism.
Yeah, there are certain other arguments, challenges making sense of the evolution of consciousness, which I explore in great detail in my book, Why, the Purpose of the Universe. Maybe a little bit tricky to get fully into, but I mean, one very simple way of getting the basic idea is that evolution is really just interested in behavior, right? Because it's behavior that matters for survival, right? Evolution wants creatures that behave in such a way that they're gonna survive well. And so it's hard to see why natural selection has a motivation to give us consciousness, to give us inner experience of the world. Why not just very complicated mechanisms that survive very well, sort of survival machines? Now, there's a very complicated debate we need to get into there that maybe would be a bit of a rabbit hole, but it was those two things, I think. It's the fine-tuning argument and also these challenges of fully bringing consciousness into our scientific story of the universe. I think we're really not at first base in thinking. A lot of people appreciate that there's some kind of difficulty with consciousness, but I don't think people have fully got on board with how really hard it is to bring consciousness fully into our standard scientific story of the universe.
You know what? We may.
So, I mean, I don't, maybe I shouldn't be going down this rabbit hole that he just said is a rabbit hole, but, this really, I mean, there are people that worry a lot about this. So Thomas Nagel has this whole book on this, and I know Philip's written about this as well. But if you're like me and you just think that the mind is the brain, then there doesn't really seem to be a mystery here, because what's being selected for are certain physical structures in the brain, and those things are what consciousness is. So if you want to get an animal to behave in a certain way, this is how you do it. You have this kind of structure, and that structure is what consciousness is. So there's no analogous kind of problem with things like water or electricity, or these other more mundane properties, whereby they're just one and the same thing. So selecting for one gives you the other because they are the same. So pain feeling a certain way, playing the role that it does, are the same thing. It's identical. They're the same state. So if you think that way, then this kind of stuff goes away. Now, I know that Philip has he has intuitions against physicalism, so that's great for him. But I don't think his arguments are very convincing. I don't need to derail the conversation here. So let's get back to the religion stuff.
I've actually skipped forward a little bit too quickly into your story. We hadn't really talked about how your beliefs looked prior to your entertaining this new theistic hypothesis. So how ardent were you about your atheism or agnosticism prior to becoming a theist?
So I was raised Catholic, practicing Catholic in a very vibrant Catholic community in Liverpool. But I gave up Christianity when I was 14. I refused to get confirmed, upset my grandmother. My mum sent me to see the friendly, youthful priest who took me for a drive and tried Pascal's wager on me. And
did you push back on it?
I did. I debated him, and
at 14.
Yeah. Well, I've been into philosophy for a very long time, and at the end of our conversation, he said, "I don't think you should get confirmed. You've thought about it. I don't think you should." I don't think my mum was too happy with that, but.
So this is why he's opting for Christianity. It's because he's brought up in a Christian background. If he had been raised Muslim, he'd probably be opting for a limited version of Islam. If he'd been raised Buddhist, he'd probably be doing that. So I think there's nothing more to why he's adopting Christianity. Although it's not clear what the Christianity part has to do with anything. So maybe they're going to talk about that. But what does he think that Jesus of Nazareth has to do with any of this stuff? Does he believe in, anyway, so the divinity of Jesus, or I don't know. So I'm sure we'll get to that.
So after that, I was quite happily in Team Atheist for 20 years. But I think I've always been a spiritual person. I guess I was in the team of spiritual but not religious, and I feel like I was happy.
Yeah, I find those kind of people very annoying, like spiritual but not religious. So, yeah, I'm not on that team.
Happy with that. I was, I didn't feel there was a God-shaped hole in my life. I suppose really it's been an intellectual journey. For me, it has to make intellectual sense first. Ultimately, it's about the experience. I think faith is about community and lived spiritual experience, but it has to make intellectual sense first. So I suppose what this has been for me is an intellectual journey of finding this form of Christianity that that makes intellectual sense to me.
You know, as someone who has gone through a conversion experience myself, you know, I want to tell myself it's all about the intellect, it's all about the arguments. But I know that for me and for everyone, there is a psychological component involved. So what would you say in your case, like what are some sort of psychological motivations that you have to embrace Christianity?
Guys, you need better hair care. Pros is a personalized made-to-order hair care that took my hair from this to this.
Yeah, it's definitely both, isn't it? As my friend Ian McGilchrist would say, it's left hemisphere and right hemisphere. It's got to be something that makes intellectual sense, but it's got to resonate at a spiritual level.
Yes.
And, you know, thinking back, I think as a child, just Christianity didn't resonate with me spiritually. I thought, you know, it's boring church services. I guess I thought of it as, are you just trying to please the old guy in the sky and so you can get to heaven? And that didn't seem to me unspiritual. I thought like Buddhism was spiritual. So I suppose that and we'll guess have to get into it. I suppose the kind of Christianity I've come to, it's not just that it makes intellectual sense to me, it makes spiritual sense to me as well. So it resonates with those spiritual convictions I've always had.
So then maybe this would be a good opportunity to discuss maybe the particulars of your version of Christianity. One area that I know that you've talked about in the past is your views on penal substitution. Why don't we talk about that? Because you don't think that penal substitution is the correct view of the atonement. Let's talk about that and then your view, the one that you subscribe to.
Yeah, so I mean, with all due respect to those who accept penal substitution,
you got to be careful because William Lane Craig is watching this, and I'm just kidding. I don't know if he's actually.
Yeah, I mean, with all due respect, I very much respect philosophers who defend penal substitution, like William Lane Craig, for example. But for me personally, I do find penal substitution one of the most implausible claims ever defended in all of philosophy and theology. So if being a Christian means accepting penal substitution, I'm not a Christian.
Is that one of the things that kind of held you back?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
I think
so
thought that's how I thought Christianity is penal substitution, and
but it had to have been beneath the surface. It had to have been just maybe one assumption that you had.
I mean, I agree. By the way, that it's a ridiculous claim to say that God punishes Jesus in order to somehow forgive us. I think the whole thing is very absurd. So I agree with him, but I wonder what the role he does think is
about, like the way that the gospel works, or the way that Christianity worked, is that Jesus took on the punishment himself that we deserved.
Yeah, I think that was somehow maybe my received view, maybe in my upbringing, or what I heard that the kind of Christians I was talking to. But actually, this is what has come out of wide reading and many conversations. Accepting penal substitution has never been essential for being a Christian, even a traditional one, right? It is one theory among many of the mechanics of Christian salvation. I think sometimes American Protestants think, no, you have to believe in penal substitution to be a Christian. But I don't think that's ever been the case, actually. So I think this is actually one of the areas where I'm not, strictly speaking, being heretical.
So there's actually a book that I've got on my shelf here by Rutledge. Have you read this one? The Crucifixion, Understanding Death of Jesus, the Death of Jesus Christ. It is about different theories of the atonement. But one of the things that Rutledge does in this book is that she offers a sort of maybe combination view of a bunch of different theories and takes and picks different things that she likes from each different theory of the atonement and then rejects the rest. And I think that's a very acceptable thing to do when it comes to theology. And maybe more broadly as well, like take the good bits of the hypothesis that you like, leave out the ones that are problematic, and then you just arrive at it might also be more comprehensive. Like it might give you a more well-rounded picture of how it all works.
Yeah, so a lot of people say, well, no, there's different, you don't just take one theory of the atonement, there's lots of different, it's like a jewel with many sides. But
different facets.
I'm sorry, I can't be on board with penal substitution.
That's one thing. Yeah, that's just one facet you just got to do.
I can't have it in the mix.
Well, so then what is your theory that you like?
So this is the participatory view, which has been defended, for example, by Robin Collins, who people might know for his work on fine-tuning, and also there's a great paper by my friend Tim Bain and Greg Restall. So the basic idea of this is that the ultimate goal of existence is for us and God to exist in a state of deep unity, a sort of deep, intimate connection. To take an analogy just kind of plucked at random, a little bit like the connection between a vine and its branches, you know, a sort of intimate, organic connection, right? So that's the goal of existence. But there's a problem, right? We're a little bit different from God, right? But we're radically different from God. I don't know about you, but you know, God's the timeless, immaterial, necessary foundation of all being, and we're just essentially temporal, embodied, contingent beings, right? So the two kind of don't fit together. Rob?
Just trying to lighten the mood.
There's a family in our driveway.
Robin Collins has a wonderful analogy. He says, you know, trying to bring God and us together is like trying to graft a branch onto a horse. You know, they're too alien, right? You can only graft a branch onto a tree, right? So there's a problem, right? Us and God don't fit together, right? So what's the solution? The solution is God to become a bit more like us, right? Take on a physical nature, enter into our form of existence. And the thought is that this closes the gap between God and creation, right? And
but how? First of all, how? Second of all, why don't we take on a non-physical form? Third of all, why does Jesus have to be crucified and killed? Fourth of all, what reason is there to think that the union between God and humans would have to be achieved bodily? Yeah, I'm not buying this, obviously.
Has the potential for God and the universe to come into this state of deep unity, like the vine and its branches. That's the view of the atonement that really makes intellectual sense to me, and that kind of resonates at a spiritual level as well.
So Jesus is the one who brings us together. He's the sort of thing that could bring a tree branch to be connected to a horse. I'm sorry that this analogy is a little bit out there, but
yeah,
is that the idea? Is that
I suppose Collins
Jesus is maybe gorilla glue, you know, that like super strong, like
you make a good point. Collins' analogy, I suppose, is good for getting at the problem, but maybe it sort of falls apart when we bring the solution in. But look, I mean, something radical and hard to make sense of is supposed to be going on here. So it's not surprising if we struggle to get a good analogy. But I think a lot of, as Collins and Bain and Restall get at, there's a lot of themes in the New Testament, Paul's letters in particular, that resonate with this, the analogy of the vine and the branches. And, you know, if you read the Jesus' Last Supper monologue more generally, there's a lot of oneness there. There's a lot of sort of a sense that the unity, the oneness between Jesus and the being he called Father is sort of being extended now to humanity. And in Paul's letters, you know, with the idea that we're members of the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. So I do think this resonates with a lot of what we find. It's not just plucked from nowhere.
So here's maybe one objection, is that the participation view, I mean, this is one of the things that Rutledge points out, is that these different theories of the atonement are not necessarily in conflict. That's why you can bring different elements together. So the participation view that you've just laid out doesn't necessarily seem to conflict with the penal substitution view. And so it might be that someone who adopts the penal substitution view might say something like, well, yes, I mean, the way that God makes it to where we can participate is that Jesus took on the sins and took on the punishment that we deserved. That's how we can now participate in the oneness of God. So what are your thoughts on someone who wants to object to that? Well, we still need someone to take on our sins, and it's got to be Jesus.
Well, absolutely. I think you're certainly right that they could be combined in that way. But again, I mean, for me, as I say, penal substitution doesn't make intellectual sense to me, doesn't resonate with me spiritually. I suppose, you know, quite simply,
what is the problem?
It doesn't seem it doesn't seem to fulfill justice to punish an innocent person, right?
Okay.
That's the core of it, really. So I suppose
what if that person, willingly chooses to do so? Like they want to take on the punishment, and there is some sort of legal precedent for this, right? I mean, William Lane Craig points that out in his work. There are, weird, esoteric sort of legal scenarios in which someone could take on the punishment that someone else deserved. Does that just still strike you as like, okay, that's a legal thing that was just like some random weird thing that humans devise, but God is not limited to that kind of thing? Why do you think that that's so problematic?
I mean, Craig's work on this is ingenious and fascinating and very interesting. But I think we're talking about man-made laws that are made up for particular pragmatic circumstances of human living. These pragmatic considerations are not what bind God, even a limited God like I believe in. I suppose ultimately I just don't see the point of it. I don't see what's achieved, right? If you need to punish us, punish us. If you want to
forgive, just forgive.
If you want to forgive, I just don't see what's achieved. Whereas, so I suppose when I was thinking about Christianity that way, it just didn't make sense to me. I suppose the participatory view, it's thinking of it more kind of metaphysically, that there's a metaphysical difficulty here of bringing the two together. And I think it fits very well with the God of limited power. So basically, my interpretation of Christianity is, right, there's a God who's on the way to making a perfect universe, but the only way they can do that is in two stages, right? In the first stage, God creates an okay universe with the right kind of physics that will eventually evolve life. And then in the second stage, God starts to slowly bring the universe to perfection by becoming more intimately connected with it, sharing in its nature, so creation can share in God's nature, and bringing the two into unity. So I suppose it's focused more on that sort of metaphysical concern. And it was seeing how well they fitted together that first made me think again about Christianity.
Why don't we shift gears a little bit and talk about your views on the resurrection?
So I just find that very implausible, that an imperfect God can create anything perfect in stages or not, much less that the way in which they would do it is by having something take physical form to become more like the thing they created. Yeah, I don't know. I find this all very puzzling, but I'm not trying to do backflips to make sense of it. So let's just move on.
If people can guess by now, are going to be pretty unique and interesting. So your view, you follow in the footsteps of Dale Allison, and he's got this view, and I assume that you've got it as well, where God is this, where the resurrection rather is a physical event, but it's not a bodily event.
If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
How do we make sense of this?
Yeah, I'm going to annoy people again, aren't I? So yeah, it was learning about the participatory view which started getting me thinking again about Christianity. But the resurrection was still
that was the gateway drug.
Yeah, that was the gateway drug. But the resurrection was still a big stumbling block, right? And
just in the sense of, like, how could something like this happen? Miracles in general are unlikely.
Well, one issue, yeah, if you believe in a God of limited power, right? And so, for me, my explanation of why we have suffering is God can't stop it, right? But if God can raise people from the dead, right, then we got the question, why don't you do that more often, God, right? There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of death, unnecessary, tragic death right now. So yeah, it was a problem. And so I needed something more, and it was the final piece of the jigsaw here, really, was reading Dale Allison's recent book on the resurrection, which kind of blew my mind. And I've had some detailed correspondence with Dale. He's kindly helped me understand.
I've heard some really nice things about Dale.
He's a good guy, yeah.
I haven't read any of his work, though. I need you to help flesh us out. What is this view?
He's a very humble guy epistemologically, and Yeah, so I see it as a kind of middle way between liberal views on the resurrection and more traditional views on the resurrection. So maybe we could take each of these in turn. I think where it sides with more liberal views on the resurrection is in thinking of the first resurrection experiences of the early Christians as being visionary in nature rather than seeing and touching a body, right? So we could think of it as, for example, similar to Paul's resurrection experience on the road to Damascus, as we find in Acts of the Apostles, right? So thrown to the ground and seeming to have some intense sort of visionary experience. So on Allison's view, what we should be thinking is shortly after Jesus died, the early Christians, first Mary Magdalene, then Peter, then the 12 and so on, started kind of being thrown to the ground and having these intense, profound visionary experiences, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, which are so intense and powerful that it's clear there's something quite radical and something profound going on here, even if there isn't a body you can see and touch. So that is the view, that is the bit that fits more with a kind of liberal view. But where I think Allison's view departs from the most liberal kind of view is in rejecting the idea that the resurrection was purely spiritual, right? Allison thinks the tomb was found empty. But rather than thinking that the body kind of got up and walked off, he thinks the body was transformed into a radically new kind of physicality, a new form of energy that can't be
All right, I can't with this anymore. So I think I got what I needed out of this discussion. I don't think his position is well motivated, as I've already been saying. I don't really care about him doing intellectual backflips in order to make sense of these minutia of the Christian view. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there. But I am curious what people think about the simulation hypothesis and the evil God of limited power, whether they are better explanations for the sorts of stuff that Goff is trying to explain. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, cool.